Greetings, and welcome to the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. In each episode, host Kirill Tokarev invites video game industry leaders to talk about the world of game development. No topic is off limits as long as it relates to video game development. New episodes are in the works, so remember to follow us or subscribe and share with someone you know will also enjoy the podcast.
So, Lori Plager, right?
Yes.
All right, cool. So, okay, let's start. So, welcome to 80 Level Roundtable, where we discuss the latest news from the game industry, talk about the new workflows, and discuss game dev in general. And today we have with us Lori Plager. I hope I didn't butcher your name. We're going to talk a bit about licensing and how does licensing work in games. I think it's an interesting topic for our audience, and there's not a lot of resources actually about it. But before we go in that direction, Lori, can you give us a little intro? Talk about your career, like where do you come from?
Absolutely. Currently I work at Sony Pictures Television, and I represent Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, those two brands for licensing. There are obviously many other intellectual properties at Sony, but those are the two that I represent. And I represent them for more than just gaming, for all sorts of categories. So in licensing, you can have people who specialize in everything from, kids to cosmetics, housewares, books, every category, apparel that you can think of. This is sort of a unique position because I cover all categories with the exception of mobile. We have a different group that does mobile for these two brands. Before I was at Sony, I had my own business for quite a few years, and I represented a lot of different companies for licensing. One of them was Peak Games, the Turkish company. For a little while, I worked with Atari for a little while, and a variety of other companies. And before that, I was at Activision with a brief stint at Brash Entertainment, very brief, but and then I was at Activision for 6.5 years, and did licensing acquisitions, so what they call licensing in. And before that, I was at Mattel, where I also did licensing in. And before that, I worked in the entertainment industry for many years. I did TV and motion picture development. So I guess, that it's a long history, and you can tell that I'm, old at this point.
I gotcha. Yeah, I had a question like, how does one get into this kind of field, right? But it seems like it's a long journey, basically, right? So you have to go. There's like no one place where you can go and say, "Hey, I want to help you with licensing your property."
Right. I think, I joke that people who work in licensing they're either, used car salesmen, or they come from they have a master's in business background. And I'm kind of kidding, but kind of not, because licensing has two different sides. It has licensing in and licensing out. Those are the simple ways to look at it. And when you're doing licensing in, you're doing acquisition. So that means that you're the buyer. When you're doing licensing out, you are selling. You are selling whatever intellectual property you have. So most people who are in licensing are on the sales side. There's just many more opportunities to sell products. There aren't as many to have a position where you're a buyer. I I started out, I have a degree in theater, came to LA hoping to work in the entertainment business. And after I worked in the entertainment business for a while, I realized that I wanted to work with people in entertainment, but not necessarily directly in that industry. And it was really hard to figure out, like, what is that transition? And someone told me that there was a position at Mattel where they were looking for somebody that had an entertainment background, and they were willing to kind of teach the licensing part. So I applied, and thank goodness I got a job there. And they taught me the licensing part, and I knew the entertainment part. So that was a good opportunity, a good way to get into that business.
That's an interesting point where you started. So I think Mattel is like a perfect example of companies who want to work with licensing more. And I guess it kind of goes into our next question is, why are companies doing this? Like, what are like the benefits of like selling your licenses or giving your licenses away or purchasing licenses if you, because what are like the triggering factors for them? What is the business overall looks like?
I think, a license, the reason to pick up a license would be to, I always say that licensing is two words. It's borrowed equity. You're borrowing something that has value to you. And that, I think, is part of the evaluation that you have to make when you are picking up a license. If you are choosing something that needs a lot of education for your audience, so it's a little bit niche and not a lot of people know about it, it has less financial value to you, and it should have less financial value associated with it when you pick up that property. So if you're looking to potentially acquire a license, and you're saying, what are some of the criteria that I have to look at in spending money on a license, what you want to know is, how much value is this going to bring to me? Do I have to educate my audience about this? Because if I do, that's going to take effort. It's going to take marketing. It's going to take a lot of other things. I will tell you, when you have brands like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, I have not had to educate anyone. There's zero, absolutely not a singular person has said, I've never heard of it before. So that makes my job a lot easier, which is great. It's not, those aren't licenses for everybody, but at least the education part is not in there. So I would say, some of the criteria that you're looking for is, how well known is this property? Is this something that I can take and actually make it gameable? Not everything is gameable. So there are many, intellectual properties out there that are huge, but you can't make a game out of them. So, all of these things are factors in making that evaluation. One thing that I will say is, a lot of times, and this happened even at Activision and at Mattel, so you have some of the biggest companies in the world with the, highly educated people who would ask the same question. And I'm going to say this to you or to your audience, is the question that you don't ask in a license is, how much does it cost? That's not really the question that you want to ask if you are evaluating a license. You need to know how much you have to spend. That's the critical part, because you have to be comfortable walking away when you know how much you have to spend, and then you make that offer, or they tell you that's what you're looking at. Because I think a lot of times people get wrapped up in, they want it so badly that they end up trying to make it work for them, when after they all is said and done, they've made a few cents on the dollar, and it's not really worth it to them. So, yeah.
It's a very interesting question. I think it's also very relatable to all people working in the game industry, because here it seems like licensing properties in game industry is like a double-edged sword. So in some examples, you can get like build very successful products, like I'd say like EA and is working with Disney, like on Star Wars titles.
Right.
And sometimes it can lead to like a total disaster. And coming from an industry, I've been here like for a while, and coming back to like the beginning of 90s or like 90s in general, there were a lot of games which are built on licenses. And if you go even further in the 80s, there are some truly horrible games which were built on like properties from film in particular, right? And all
Right.
of those games were like of poor quality, they were not really there. And I think it was that time when those industries kind of learned how to work with each other,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But it seems that this is slowly going away right now. So, so what's your take on it? Do you still feel that there is like a lot of headbutting and people kind of don't know what to do with the license when they get there, or is it like more fluent right now and people kind of understand how to make something gameable, as you put it?
I think there's definitely been a learning curve. I started at Activision in 2002, I believe, and I think it was still a little bit of the Wild West at that time. It, I remember when I got there, watching producers write their own scripts and not really having necessarily writing skills. That's not what they, you can't be a specialist in everything. And the fact that they could actually make a video game was astounding to me. It's definitely not a skill I have. And, writers don't necessarily have those skills either, but the producers would write their own games, and sometimes that was disastrous. Sometimes you need to get expertise from people who actually know how to write a script or tell a story, because a lot of games are story driven. So I think there's been a shift in how people put these games together and how and what they look for as far as criteria that makes something successful. I'm not sure if I just answered your question or I went into another direction.
No. I know what you mean, right? So it's definitely a learning on both sides, but I definitely see a shift for the better, at least like in the last kind of like 10 years in general in the industry, because
Yeah.
the games built on someone else's IP becoming better and more
Right.
successful and so on. Funny enough, a lot of companies who were licensing properties before are now getting their own game studios and kind of work with it. So it seems like Warner Brothers is a good example where they have
Mhm.
their own.
Right. Their own
Yeah,
studios.
they
Yeah.
have their own studios and they work on like a Lord of the Rings games and so on and so forth. So that's interesting as well. But
Right.
let's get back a little bit and look at the situation where, let's say we have a company who wants to license something, right? They think
Right.
they have a perfect idea, and sometimes they have even a prototype or a vertical shift, but to make more sales or to get like to a wider audience, like a global audience, they need some kind of a property to, support it. And what would they do in this situation? So where should they go? How do they approach this question? Because there's not like a door where you can knock and say, "Hey, this is
Right.
our licensing office. Like, let's do business."
Right, right. I think if they've identified a license, so using the ones that I have right now as an example, the best way is to a simple way would be to go through LinkedIn and try to connect and say, this is what I have, or email somebody directly if they have that information. People who are in sales always want to make a sale. My job is to bring in money for a company, and that's what, so I like to hear from legitimate people about, um, you know, possibilities. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that, it is obviously it's competitive. So if you have a big property, you are licensing it out, you're going to look at things like, what does this company have to bring to this situation? Am I going to go with a company that's very well known or one that is less known? Why or why not? Some people feel like I'm only interested in going with a big company because I know that they're going to have the marketing and the support and the money to develop a game, a good game. Everybody wants a good quality game, so that's important. And I think competency in the area that, if you have somebody who's only developed kids games and you've got, an action title, they're going to have to really show you that they can make a game that has that sort of competency. I think when someone is thinking about approaching someone about an IP, they have to say, given all of the other factors, why is this person going to go with me? And sometimes companies feel like, well, these other big companies, they're focused on their big IPs. I'm going to get lost somewhere in this, and maybe I will be the crown jewel of this smaller company. That is also a consideration that people have. Again, though, it has to do with, you don't want to be the crown jewel in a company where they have no money to really make a good game. That doesn't work either. So
it's interesting that you say that there is basically a bunch of different factors that you can weigh when you're making this decision. It's not just like you said, it's not the price, basically. It's not the
right,
investment.
right, because ultimately I think what you're looking for is, you want to be able to have a good quality game, and you also want to have lots of sales. So those are the two factors that everybody wants. And because you don't want to diminish the quality of your intellectual property. So if something is out there and it's not a great game, everybody knows that you just licensed it out and maybe you made some money, but that does not help you when you're trying to make sales in other categories, because people have a bad memory of what that means. And especially in gaming, if you have an entertainment property, gaming is the closest you are going to get to people's personal involvement, other than, if you have a television show or a movie, people are sitting there, they're entranced, they're watching it, they're involved. Same thing with gaming. So this is really maybe a half step down from what they're trying to express. So you really have to be able to do that effectively. And I think, Carol, you also asked me about, what are the things that somebody might need or think about when you're approaching someone. One thing that I would say is, never assume that you know that person's property better than they do. So I've seen people before come in and pitch things where they've kind of taken control over the assumption that they know it better than the people in the room, and that can get really dangerous very quickly. I think you have to go in and you do your best in a presentation, and try to be as true to the product as possible. But if you have a twist or a different way that you want to present it, say that up front. Be nice about being honorable and complimentary to what the people have already created, and say, I love that, but I also want to take it in a different direction, and why. And it can't just be because I feel like being creative. It's got to have some sort of reasoning behind that.
I really like that note, Lori. I think for me personally, it's sort of a miracle that these deals are actually happening, because I understand that people like on the other side, like the property holders, it's like their baby.
Yeah.
It's like and you're like, it's your daughter, and you're giving her away to some guy who's like,
That's right.
is he reliable? Can you trust him? What is he going to do? So like, these are all the questions that are on your mind when you're kind of doing this deal.
Right.
So
right. You're absolutely right. It's a good analogy. I mean, people put in years and years and years on working on these shows or these IPs, and they know them inside and out, and they're very emotionally attached to them. And it's the same thing with when your groups create games and somebody comes in and tries to tell them what to do with that game, or how to express it in version number 2. You really have to be sensitive to the fact that they already have a vision. So I think, especially if you're looking at things like game shows, you have to realize that there is already gameplay there. And if you're going to make a suggestion in changing that, you have to, again, have a reason why you're doing that. And sometimes what you have to do is educate the people on the other side about the reason why you're doing it. They don't always know gaming. In fact, most of the people that you here, I mean, this is, I think, a good point here, is that your people, and I'm saying anybody listening to this, have expertise in their particular areas, and they cannot assume that the people on the other side have any idea of how that works. It's probably always better to come in and just say, this is how this works. I'm showing you. This is why I'm thinking this. So the other side can go, oh, okay, I didn't know that. you know,
mhm, mhm.
again, you can't be good at everything. So
Yeah, I mean, I think with these deals, it has to make sense, right? So when you're, I'm just trying to think of some examples, and there is a studio in Sweden, I think. They're doing like big open world games, which with a bunch of driving,
right.
and they've been like relatively successful. They have the tech for it, and one of the properties that they worked on was actually Mad Max,
Uh-huh.
and that was a very good fit because they already had the tech. They understood like how it worked. They knew how to build this world and game, and then they just kind of worked with the property holder, I guess, to kind of figure all the details out and so on. And this kind of drives me to the next question: is um, who holds the control basically when you're doing these kind of collaborative projects, when you're licensing out an IP to someone? Like, how do you control your IP? How do you make sure that nothing is sort of like broken and so on? Is there like a legal document for that, or are there other methods, like is there like weekly syncs with the developers, or how does that work?
Yes. I will tell you, I think there's a very deep misunderstanding on both sides at the beginning of these processes, because you try to get everything down in the contract in the very beginning and say, these are the steps. this is what has to happen. You do presentations at certain junctures to make sure that people are signed off, and you get that sign off in writing, email. Yes, you were approved for the next step, blah, 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 blah. So there are all of these markers, just like when a developer is working with a studio. It's the same thing when you're working with an IP holder. Um, all of those markers have to be very, very clear. And hopefully the IP holder has an idea of how that works on the development side as well. I have seen and heard many times over where a licensor is not necessarily tech savvy, and they don't know that even though that they've said yes to something, that means that that person is able to go on, and there's certain things that cannot be changed later. And if you are dealing with somebody who's not tech savvy, it's really incumbent upon the studio, the developer, to say, I want you to understand that what you've just approved means that this, and this will never be able to be changed, because I know that there are costs that go into things later, and people sometimes don't realize that there's no going back after that step. So again, I think there's got to be a lot of communication between the two when there are sign-offs. But those things, I know that you're saying, well, how do you protect each end? A lot of times people, I think, well, I'm not going to give them my baby because they're just going to take it and make all of these changes and I won't have any say in it. No, that does not happen. It really doesn't happen, because you have a legal document that has to be followed, and you set that up and you agree to that at the very beginning. So those things are not really going to happen. Nobody's really going to take it and twist it and make it something that you haven't approved, unless you are not careful in those steps.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And it kind of goes into all the kind of types of media licensing deals, right? So it's not only about games, because like a lot of guys in our audience, they are creating their own stuff. They're building their own properties, and these are kind of like baby steps. It's like
Right.
a sketch here, like something, a story there, and slowly but surely they're like building their own little world, I would say. And for them, sometimes they want to see it like in the form of a book. Sometimes they want to try to sell it to, like, I'd say Netflix for like an animation film or something like that. But Lori, I had a talk with a publisher. I think it's Dark Horse Publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with them a little bit about that, and I asked them the same question. So, would you be open to do a deal like that? And they said basically that no, we really, if we're investing anything in an IP or any kind of like license, we want to make sure that it's very popular, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is there a chance for someone who's kind of like in the beginning, and
Right.
they might be popular in their own kind of little world, right? But they don't have like millions and millions of sales and or followers or copies sold or whatever. How do they operate here? Should they be trying to work on their own? Should they seek kind of partnerships elsewhere and not kind of rely on this IP licensing model at all? I know maybe it's like a little bit out of your expertise.
No, I mean, I think it's a question that comes up actually fairly frequently, and it really goes back to the original part of the original question about, what makes a license? You're borrowing equity, meaning you're borrowing something that already has perceived value. When somebody's creating something on their own, it's an original intellectual property. It's not really a license in that way. It may be licensable because they want to license it, but it doesn't have any perceived value other than to them or their family or their small audience at that point. So I don't necessarily think that it's a typical licensing proposition. What they're really trying to do is create their own brand, and
Yeah,
that
exactly.
right, and that takes a little bit of a different turn. I think that they do have to work on it quite a bit on their own and try to put things together, find studios or publishers or people that they can partner with that who believe that they would like to be investing in an original intellectual property, not
Mhm.
a licensed property. I think there are a lot of companies when I was at Activision, um, again, everything's cyclical. Sometimes licensing is very popular and everything's licensed. And sometimes there's not, we're getting away from licensing. No more licensing. Everything's an original IP. I personally think it works well when you have some of one and some of the other, because you've got a little bit of a balance there. When I was working at Activision, they had some original IPs and some licenses. So, um, I think that the people who are just starting out, it doesn't mean that their art or their story or their concept isn't as good as something that's licensed. It just means that cyclically it's at the beginning. A license is, you know, on that scale of 1 to 100, it's in the 85 to 100% mark time-wise, and theirs
Mm.
is at the very beginning of that mark.
Yeah, totally. No, that makes sense. I mean, what you're saying is basically it's just too early for that when
Right,
you're at those stages. But
right.
you can still think about it. You can still plan ahead and figure out that if it becomes successful, if it becomes like whatever, you can potentially make a license and so on. And
Right.
I think it's still a very interesting kind of way to connect things that are usually not that easily connected. Like I guess in games, like a Mortal Kombat series is a good
Mhm.
example because
Right.
it's a character-based game, and they basically license characters from all over. They have like Rambo, they have like
Mhm.
Terminator, and then they have
Mhm.
their own roster of characters, and then they can add someone like a RoboCop or something. So it's like for a creative person, I think it's a very fun and interesting tool to play around with.
Right.
It just has to make sense, okay, as you said. Like so,
Right. Right. And that is another kind of licensing. What actually what you're talking about is, I kind of jokingly call it stunt licensing, because you're stunting it with, or guest star licensing. You're stunting it with little bits of popularity that attracts people's attention. So you can have something that is an original IP where you put licenses in it, or you have a level that's licensed, a
mhm.
level or a character or something like that. So it's another way to continue to build interest in your original IP.
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of bigger publishers, they have a wider library, and for them it's easier to kind of do these cross
Mhm.
references inside because they kind of already own all the rights.
Right.
But yeah, I guess right now we're living almost like in a golden age of that, because you can have games like where there is like Mario and Sonic in one game, and it's like
Right.
an Olympic Games or something, right? So it's
Right.
like, to think about this, like before, it was crazy because those were like competitors and they would never work together. But I think it
Right.
all kind of like changes and blurs with time. But
Right.
I have another question, maybe a bit controversial, so you don't have to answer if you don't. I
Just
mean,
who I voted for? No.
no, no, that we're not interested. No, that the question is like, you've seen a lot of licensing deals, and they're like saw a lot of examples of them. Like, what were maybe some of the craziest, most unusual kind of things on those deals, or some of the weirdest kind of limits or questions that they had there. So do these things exist? Because I think in our kind of perception, it's they do exist. Like, you can only use like Mickey Mouse in this certain way and not the
Uh-huh,
other.
Yeah,
You
right,
know?
right, right. I think that, well, I would say that every licensor is protective over their IP because that's all they have. That's what they're giving you, their daughter, as you said. And they want to be able to present that IP in the most favorable light and something that doesn't damage it. So, I will just say, as an example, when you do a deal with the two brands that I'm representing now, Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, they're very protective because those shows have been on for 37 and 38 years. And so the public has a perception of them, which is that they're family friendly, that they are, they're staples of the American community. And with Jeopardy, I think a lot of times people think, oh, I could just write my own, we call them clues and responses. They're
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
like questions and answers. I'll just write my own. That's not really how the show works. The show is so exacting, and when you watch it, you realize that when someone gives an answer, it's either correct or it's not. And it's just a very black and white thing. So people don't write in and say, "Oh, they gave the wrong answer, and the show let it go." That doesn't happen. So in certain parts of IP, they can be very, very, very specific. That show is super protective over the clues and responses. Absolutely locked it down. There's just no wiggle room on that. So most of the time, they will write the clues and responses for the licensee, and that's part of the licensing deal that the licensee pays for. If they want 100 clues and responses, we have people that write those for them, and that's how that works most of the time. So I think that, yes, I worked at Mattel also, and there are certain rules with Barbie and other dolls and how they're presented, and just some, I don't know if there are any specific funny stories, but just questions that people ask,
Uh-huh.
about things. Again, those are not video game licenses, but I can tell you that at one point when I worked at Activision, and I'm not going to say which game this was, but apparently one of the artists or someone who was working on it, hmm, it was a superhero game, and they had worked in just very briefly a scene where two characters kissed. And I mean, it was all of about 2 seconds, but those two characters that would never, ever happen. And the licensor saw this and just flipped out. It's not good. It was not good. And you can't, you can't do things like that just because you think it's either amusing or people won't notice. I'm not sure.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know how many of those happened, but I can tell you on the financial end, which may be one of your questions. I've done deals for, and again, I'm not going to say which ones they are for $200,000, and I've done deals for $69 million.
Mm-hmm.
And those can be, that's when you get a lot of crazy stories because people get very anxious when the money keeps going up.
Yeah, yeah, but that's the example you gave. I think it's a perfect one, right? Because um, all comes back like to the idea that you have to know the brand that
Right,
you're working with. You have to know whom you're dealing with, and you have to be careful. I mean,
right,
you
right.
have to discuss all those kind of things and listen and so on because there were so many stories with um, like Lucas Arts.
Mhm.
Like they wanted to build a like a modern sort of like an Uncharted kind of game based on Star Wars, and it was like it was horrible because they couldn't come up to Disney, or at that time I think it wasn't Disney even, to like George Lucas basically, and ask him whether this guy can do this thing or can this
Mhm.
guy do that thing, right? And they had like this whole sessions with him and tried to figure out. And whenever they got an opportunity to kind of introduce a new character into like this universe, they were
Right.
like super excited, and then they thought they were, it's if they were fixing the Bible or something, like, they were like,
Right,
I mean,
right.
it's
Yeah.
a lot of like responsibility, I think, in general.
Yes, and again, I think it goes back to if you want to do something different with someone's baby, you're going to have to come up with a good reason why. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you really have to kind of take your ego or your team's ego out of it just because, hey, wouldn't this be cool? Is probably not going to be enough of a reason to do something.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, I think it's like mutual self-respect in all regards, and that way it can work.
right.
Um, so, Lori, we are almost out of time. I have maybe the last question is,
Okay.
um, when you're doing these licensing deals, and from the both parties, like from the side of the buyer and from the side of the seller, what are like the main pitfalls that you want to avoid? Like, what are the mistakes that you don't want to make when you're kind of doing deals like that?
I think beginning as early as you can, especially with video game licenses, you have a much longer lead time than most types of licensing. If you do apparel, somebody can, you know, put something on a t-shirt very quickly, but the lead time in video games is long, and you're going to have to pad that with the amount of time that you're going to spend negotiating the deal even before you begin. So, you've got that is a consideration. Um, I think also there are some basic tenets in every licensing deal, which is a guarantee, a royalty. Those two are pretty much in every deal. You've got to think about, um, what can you, if you're the buyer, what can you pay up front? How will that roll out over the period of years? From the licensee's side, you want as many years as you can to be able to, you know, utilize the license. And from the other side, you're looking for the shortest amount of time, or a reasonable amount of time, but you don't want to give somebody, more time than they need because you may end up wanting to license it to someone else. You have to look at things like exclusivity. Are they just looking for certain regions? Is it a worldwide license? I think those are some of the main points, and I just think, again, on the financial end, you just really have to think through, what can I afford? What
Hmm.
would what would make me what would if I get this deal and I hit this mark, would that make me happy? Can I afford to do that?
Well, yeah, I think those are great advice. I mean, if somebody's kind of go into that direction. Lori, I just want to thank you for your time today. Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much. It was a super interesting conversation. I could go like forever and ever about all those stories and
You.
licensing, but you probably have some other stuff to do. So
Okay. Thank
thank
you
you so.
very much. Very nice to meet you, and nice to meet all of you, even though I'm not talking to you. Nice to meet everyone. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Lori.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for enjoying another episode of the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. Check out upcoming episodes on the 80 Level website at 80.lv. Join our career site at 80.lv/RFP. And share our podcast with friends and on your social networks.